hearing you guys talk at South by Southwest about not making those distinctions between indie rock and pop. It's all music. If me as a critic, I have something to say, I'm going to say it. So I have no idea what you think about R. Kelly, but I knew you both would have thought about him. And I'm curious, why don't we just start there? Are you guys fans of R. Kelly?
I'm definitely a fan of his music, and I think this is one of the things that makes this such a complicated question. Is that if you look at just the work on itself, on its own merits, I think he's an incredibly talented songwriter, a really persuasive performer, really charismatic, and someone who really deserves a lot of respect on just as an artist. And that obviously makes it much harder, therefore, to just sort of write him off based on all of the extremely problematic things that are in other aspects of his life.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of the music as well. I got into him when Trapped in the Closet came out, and I've been following his career ever since. And for as far as writing R&B singles, I don't think there's anyone who tops him.
Yeah. Were you out there at Coachella, David, to see him sing with Phoenix?
I didn't make it out this year, unfortunately. I did catch the video on YouTube.
Yeah, I did too. All right. All right. I figured we all had, right? You had to, because it was just so interesting. So the Coachella appearance with Phoenix, he's playing Bonnaroo, and he's headlining and closing out Pitchfork. If you go to Solar Coaster, he remarks a couple of times about the indie rock kids love this, and wasn't that interesting? And it seems to be that he's making a conscious choice to reach out to that audience this summer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So what does it say to you guys as critics, as the Pitchfork demographic? And I mean no malice by that, right? But you're the age group, that fills Union Park in Chicago. Pitchfork especially. What do you make of that booking?
I think we've seen a lot of especially younger hip-hop and R&B folks, someone like The Weeknd, for example, making music that, if not being explicitly for that audience, has been embraced by it. So I think someone like R. Kelly can look at that, or even Usher, working with
Frank
Diplo
Ocean.
And Frank Ocean. So I think there's a lot going on where someone like R. Kelly, who's been in the business long enough, can look and see this is the trend, this is where the new audiences are, and go after that. So I think it makes a lot of sense for him.
Yeah, and I think actually R. Kelly sort of pioneered that crossover. There was this moment in his career that was around 10 years ago where he had already built up a reputation as a very successful R&B singer just within that genre, and then there was this sort of crossover moment when Trapped in the Closet started, and even before that with the Ignition remix, where he crossed over to this a different, more sort of indie-leaning, less R&B friendly audience. And so I think this is something he's been capitalizing on for years now.
Yeah. Do you think that the majority of the younger audiences at Coachella, at Bonnaroo, at Pitchfork are aware of the controversy that dogged him for more than 15 years? You think they were aware? They were aware of the Chappelle skit, right? But how deep is their knowledge of what the story actually was?
That's an interesting question. I think most young people are definitely aware of the controversy on some level. There's the Chappelle skit. There's also in Macklemore's Thrift Shop, which was a huge -- hit. There's a sort of crude, corny, childish joke about that controversy.
Well, there was the Boondocks, and there was the barbershop jokes in the films.
Right. So I think people are aware of the controversy in general, but I think you're probably right. I hadn't thought about it until recently when you brought this issue up, but I think you're right that for a lot of people it's just sort of a joke or a punchline, and people aren't necessarily aware. Younger people aren't necessarily aware of sort of the full depth of the story, and I think that's sort of a disturbing and problematic thing.
What do you think, David?
Well, I think especially at somewhere like Coachella, for example, there was just the semi-offensive Jimmy Kimmel skit where he went out and asked girls about made-up bands at playing the festival, and they were like, "Oh, I love that band." And I think a lot of the people coming to something that gets 50,000 or 200,000 attendees, their knowledge of R. Kelly is not going to be particularly in depth. So my guess would be a lot of people, especially younger people, who aren't, if they're not tapped in, if they haven't been following R. Kelly's career a little bit, they may show up at Pitchfork and not really be aware of this stuff. So I think that is a potential danger.
This leads to the million-dollar question. If the audience isn't aware, Should they be?
You're right that certainly the things that R. Kelly has been accused of are pretty horrific. There's this added layer of complexity where the allegations themselves are incredibly disturbing and, something that should really give any fan pause, but at the same time he did stand trial and was acquitted, which makes it,
right.
That doesn't excuse it or mean that those things, didn't happen necessarily, but it makes it more complicated. It's a more complicated question. But definitely in terms of your question of should this matter, I think sure it should definitely matter. I think it's obviously important to separate the work from the artist who creates it, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be considering both things. They're both important things.
Well,
yeah, I think you can't be super informed on every single thing you support, but certainly whenever you open your wallet and spend money on something, you are making a political choice to some level. And if you're choosing to support the music of R. Kelly, you should be aware that this is his history. These are the actions that he has been accused of, and that's it's true for many artists. It's true for Snoop Dogg or Michael Jackson or anyone who's had these kinds of controversies. I think people should definitely be aware and then make that decision.
These fans are people who would not go to Walmart, right? Because Walmart is anti-union, and they don't hire gay people, and they're right-wing causes, right? We'll go to Target and we'll spend a little more for our dish detergent or whatever, and yet you're not thinking about, all right, I really want to see Bjork, and I want to see Parquet Courts, and I want to see Wire, and I want to see Savages, right? But I'm against Pitchfork having booked this man who's accused of hurting so many young women. All right, how do we register our complaint? It seems like no one is thinking of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a situation where there's no easy answer. I think that in some ways just, blacklisting him forever and refusing to think about his work is both too easy and in some ways, sort of doesn't even do service to the idea of, honoring the victims and being aware of that. Because if we're not listening to his work and we're not, thinking about it, then we're not thinking about the, sort of crimes he's been accused of either. So I don't think that just not booking him for festivals is necessarily the answer. But I do think that it's a discussion that needs to be had, and it's something that definitely should be talked about. And ideally, it would be great if we lived in a world where we could both appreciate the art and also, discuss these sort of more problematic aspects and sort of, hold those two opposing but related ideas at the same time.
Well, that's our job to raise the question, right?
Right.
And it's not pleasant because the first thing, for the record, I am firmly in favor of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Okay, but to raise any question of morality in music, it instantly has you boxed in a corner as a moralist.
Right. Right, and no one wants to be the stodgy moralist, but at the same time, I think it is fair to to seek a fuller understanding of the artists who create the art that we love and to understand who they are, the good and the bad. I think it's important to do that.
One thing we saw at Pitchfork last year with the protests against Odd Future being booked, and Odd Future is a group who had not actually gone out and done any of these things. They were just rapping about them. But I think having those protesters there sparks a conversation, and Pitchfork had to respond to it, and then it just became something that people were aware of. And I think, if not the best thing, but one thing that can be done is just creating the conversation and having it humming through Twitter and Tumblr and all of these outlets, and having people be aware that these are the stakes of this happening.
Yeah, I would agree with that with David, and I think that actually that's right. I mean, the Odd Future thing is an interesting parallel. There was a time last year or 2 years ago when there was a huge amount of debate about the more controversial aspects of their lyrics, and there was a lot of hand wringing, like, are we debating this too much? Do we need to talk about this? And I think actually, no. I think it was great that there was that debate. I think it's it's important to both to talk about what we appreciate in their lyrics and what repels us in their lyrics. I think it's important to do both of those things, and I think that was actually a sign of a healthy discussion and a healthy populace, that people were debating that and talking about it and really getting into it.
So far, it seems like we're all saying that okay, if people aren't aware of Kelly's actual, the record of young women he hurt, if they're not aware of that, one of our jobs as cultural critics and journalists is to make them aware and at least raise the conversation. But what, gentlemen, if part of the appeal, what does it say if part of the appeal for part of the audience is that this guy actually did these things.
But I think this is an example where knowledge of the artist's actual life can give us a sort of deeper and more nuanced understanding of the work. So it's easy to listen to something like Sex in the Kitchen and think it's just sort of a cartoon, but it's not. There's actually a sort of darker subtext to it, and I think it's worth exploring that, and I think it actually makes the work more interesting, not less.
Yeah, I would say the average listener is not hearing that subtext as much. I mean, certainly when I put on R. Kelly, there is a remove from what I've read about him and the character that he's portraying and the emotions and images that are coming through in his lyrics.
Yeah. So you're able to make that separation.
I do, and I have a lot of friends who are pretty serious R. Kelly fans, and we definitely have a conversation every once in a while. Like, he's probably the worst person, the worst human being that we sit and really thoroughly enjoy his music. But when I put on his singles collection or his greatest hits, like, it just doesn't. I don't have that level of connection to it.
Mm. Right. Yeah, I mean, to me, the knowledge, like you're saying, the knowledge of what it is that he's apologizing for when he sings something like "Heaven, I Need a Hug," to me, that makes that a much more interesting song. It makes it a less, it's not just a sort of cloying sentimental Hallmark card. There's a real struggle and a real complication to it, and I think to me that makes it actually fascinating and much more compelling as a work of art.
Okay, and there have been great books written by anti-Semites, despicable people, and yet, sometimes the ideas, sometimes the language, sometimes the art, Wagner. All right, whatever his failings as a human being.
This is a valid question and a complicated question that doesn't have a simple answer. I would argue that the level of fandom, the fact, the level to which people appreciate his art means that we can't just completely rule out, booking him to perform at a festival. I think there are fans who want to see him perform, and they find something in his art worth celebrating. At the same time, I think that's why it's our job as critics to not let these other things rest and to continue sort of provoking the discussion. I think it would be a mistake to just celebrate him and not talk about those things, but I think it would similarly be a mistake to just completely, ban him from further performance.
Mm. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, it is a tough question. I mean, speaking as a fan, I would like to go see him perform, but it does become an extremely uncomfortable position. I mean, I guess to one extent, he has stood trial. He did go through that process. So I guess you have to draw the line between where you consider him having paid to some extent for what he did or being responsible for certain things. And obviously, certainly you having done this reporting, you're much closer to it than I would be.
I think it's important to make sure that we apply the same standard to R. Kelly that we do to other artists. He is certainly far from the only professional musician or rock star who has been accused of having sexual relations with underage fans. That is a thing that happens, and there are any number of people we could go over those accusations.
We're in a different position than Pitchfork. Although we're all cultural critics, and so is everybody who writes for Pitchfork, Pitchfork is also in the business of promoting music. And, you guys at Rolling Stone, at Billboard, as bloggers, as freelancers, and me as an author, as a radio show, none of us are putting on concerts and taking money to present an artist. Is that a significant difference?
That is a significant difference, and I think that is the big difference. And I think it would be nice to think that Pitchfork could kind of separate those two things and maybe run a long critical essay on their website, getting into some of these more complicated things at the same time as with their promoting wing, putting on a concert with him. I don't know if that's something they're planning on doing, but it would be nice.
Yeah.
I think that's a line that is actually blurred quite a bit. I mean, if you look at South by Southwest, there are certainly events sponsored by Billboard, sponsored by Rolling Stone. Billboard did a series of summer concerts last year, one with Katy Perry. And these are things that Billboard is covering as well. So there is certainly, and I think that's something that's happened more in kind of the blog era as the relationship between the journalist and the artist, or the journalist and promoters have softened a bit. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to say Pitchfork is kind of the odd man out here. I think they're the farthest along because they're actually running a full-on festival. But I think you could find, if you wanted to look at other publications, I think everyone, to an extent, has their fingers in that pie.
Does it ever worry you about the slippery intersections of business and criticism?
It does for me. I think, as someone who has run his own blog and has done a lot of different things, and I'm a full-time freelancer now, so I have to figure out kind of on a day-to-day basis, how do I make money while retaining my integrity? So it's a decision that I have to just be aware of, and as long as I can go to bed and feel like I did right by readers and didn't leave anything out and everything that needed to be full disclosed, was, then I can feel good about it. But it's definitely something that I have to be aware of.
I'm smiling, David, because isn't that an old school Gen X concept and not a millennial worry? Selling out?
Well, I'm not so much worried about selling out as I am with authenticity. I want to make sure if I'm writing about, a band on my blog, say the band LA Font, which a good friend of mine plays bass in, and I've written about them for a long time, I want it to be clear I'm writing about this because I think it's great and I've watched this band evolve, but also, yes, like a person in this band was in my wedding, So I don't want there to be any, and I wouldn't necessarily write about that band at this point for, say, Billboard, but I would put it on my personal blog. So
that's an
I'm
ancient
just
journalistic standard. If anybody can accuse you of a conflict of interest, you say this is what the relationship is, and you head it off at the pass.
Right.
Simon, what about you?
Well, I sold out a long time ago, so I might be the wrong person to ask about that. But yeah, no, I think this is a negotiation that anyone who writes and wants to be employed and make a living off of it, it's a negotiation that we all have to have with ourselves and figure out how we can take money for what we're doing without completely, selling out all of our integrity. I hope I've been able to walk that line, but that's probably for someone else to determine.
Well, none of us are making enough money to have been considered as selling out,
Right. Exactly.
It's interesting, that word authenticity, though, because that is the big bugaboo, right? And that's, I guess, what I was getting at that question before, is Kelly certainly, if we can sum up the trapped in the closet persona, the sex in the kitchen, the jungle persona, all that, it's essentially sexual super freak. Do what thou will is the whole of the law. And that would seem to be authentic.
Well, yeah, but I think it's sometimes more complicated and nuanced than that. There are certainly songs where he's just a super freak, and that's the entirety of the content. But I think Trapped in the Closet is actually a really interesting example. That's a story about sort of sexual licentiousness that has this undercurrent of guilt and retribution and things haunting the protagonists and coming back to haunt them. That I think it's hard to look at that and not make some parallels to what went on in Kelly's own life. And I think that actually a lot of the people who watch Trapped in the Closet and just sort of point and laugh and say, "Ha ha, there's R. Kelly with the midget," are missing a sort of really, really fascinating and problematic in certain ways, but I think a really interesting and compelling work of art that's a lot deeper and more complex than that.
Mm.
I think one thing that is maybe misunderstood among, I guess I can say, our generation's appreciation for certain kinds of art. I mean, if you look at a film like The Room, which is this new cult movie, which people have said is the worst movie ever. Or
Human Centipede, right? Similar to The Room.
Exactly, and it's not that these movies are... The Room is extremely amateurish, but calling it the worst or bad kind of misses the interesting things that it does to the medium of film, and that by making certain mistakes and by having this level of clumsiness, it allows for humor and emotions that wouldn't come through in an effectively produced studio film that is just not interesting or has a crappy script or something. And I think there's a lot of that in R. Kelly's work it is this larger than life persona, and something like Trapped in the Closet, when I watch it, I'm not receiving it as this is who R. Kelly is. I'm receiving it on a cartoonish level, and I feel like he is in on the joke and he knows what he's doing, and he's very sincere about creating this world. And so I appreciate the level of sincerity he's putting into making something ridiculous. And my appreciation of that is not ironic. It's just on a different level than, an Oscar drama or a Radiohead album or something like that. It's just a different wavelength.
Yeah. And then it's our job as a critic to also point out this other level of meaning that we all should consider.
Right, absolutely.